In this video, we're just going to go one step farther with factoring and talk about factoring larger expressions. So we mainly focus on quadratics, but sometimes there's things like there's x cubes and things. All right, you can still factor these potentially if you factor out the greatest common factor first. And I would always recommend doing that first because sometimes just factor out the greatest common factor is all you can do. Other times it just makes the part you actually do have to factor much simpler. But let's look at this. All right, if we just looked at this really quickly, you would say I can't factor that because it's x to the fourth. The only thing we know how to factor is x squared quadratics. But if you look at all these terms, they all have something in common. Right? They all are divisible by 2, and they all have two x's, two copies of x. So I can factor out a 2x squared and get this left over. All right, now this 2x squared can kind of just hang out at the front. And this, in parentheses, is one of our quadratics. We've already actually seen it in a practice problem. We can factor that into its two linear parts. So by factoring out a greatest common factor first, you give yourself something smaller to work with that you actually can factor. So always try to factor out the greatest common factor first because it's going to make the whole process simpler, the big thing that you're trying to factor. And sometimes you see something like this. This is kind of confusing if you're trying to do the splitting method. You have a -1, there's like a +0 here that you can't see. So this might be confusing. But if you just think about the greatest common factor, they both have an x. So just pull the x out and I'm done. So we had a problem like this on a test where this was equal to 0. And a lot of people struggle with solving this. But if you just factor out this x, then it's pretty simple to solve. You get 0 and 1. So by factoring out the greatest common factor, sometimes you don't have to do the full splitting method, or it actually enables you to do the splitting method. So that's the end of our factoring review. I mainly focus on factoring quadratics, but we have some shortcuts. We have to know how to factor out the greatest common factor because that's part of that. So we want to be able to break down expressions because it helps us solve and kind of see what's making up something bigger.